Today, we will be looking at three short stories, each of them found in the Gospels. And the context for each of these stories is the same, that throughout the land of Judah, Jesus is traveling around from town to town and he is helping people. Everywhere he goes, he leaves behind a trail of miracles and changed lives, stories of sick people being healed, outcasts being welcomed, and miracles as have never been seen before are left in his wake. Perhaps more than anything, news of Jesus healing the sick and disabled spreads like wildfire throughout the country. And as you can imagine, people from every corner of the land come flocking to wherever Jesus is. Great crowds bringing their family members, their friends, their neighbors, and those in need of healing. And it is in such a context that we dive into our first story of the day, found in the book of Mark, chapter 2, from verse 1, where it says, Jesus again entered Capernaum. The people heard that he had come home. They gathered in such large numbers that there was no room left, not even outside the door, and he preached the word to them. So we are told here that Jesus, after making rounds throughout the country, comes to the region he grew up in, the region called Galilee, specifically to a town called Capernaum. And when the people who lived in Capernaum hear that Jesus has returned, they come to find him in such great numbers that the house he's staying in is cram-packed full of people. There isn't even room outside the door for those who want to listen in. And as we read, Jesus begins speaking about the scriptures to those who are there. But then something happens. Verse 3. Some men came, bringing to him a paralyzed man carried by four of them. Since they could not get him to Jesus because of the crowd, they made an opening in the roof above Jesus by digging through it and then lowered the mat the man was lying on. So, interrupting Jesus' teachings comes four men who are carrying between them on a mat, a bit like a stretcher, a paralyzed man. But imagine if the house is so packed full that people can't even stand outside the door to listen. How are these four men going to get the one they're carrying to Jesus? It's not a matter of one person pushing through the crowd. You've no doubt seen someone being carried on a stretcher before, even if it's just off the pitch on a football game. You need room, you need space to maneuver with a stretcher, and you can't just squeeze a paralyzed man through a crowd. He might get harmed. And so the text tells us that they come up with a brilliant idea of getting the house owners a brand new skylight free of charge. Because they dig through the roof above Jesus' head, a hole large enough to lower the mat with this paralyzed man into the house. Verse 5. Seeing their trust, Jesus said to the paralyzed man, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Now, if you go to a dentist's office with a scarf wrapped around your head, holding your jaw in pain, and your dentist, upon seeing you, says, "Oh, here you go. We're giving away free pens today. Go ahead and grab one." You might think, well, that's great about the pens and all, but that's not really why I'm here today. And that's usually not why you go to the dentist's office. And similarly, it may have seemed strange to all these people standing around as they clearly see a paralyzed man being brought to Jesus. Jesus, who is famous for healing people. But then hearing the man being told, "Your sins are forgiven." As you might have thought at the dentist, these people might have thought, well, Jesus, I don't think that's why he came here today. Because all the crowd knows about this man is their first impression of him. And what is their first impression? It is what they can see. They see he is lame. They see he is paralyzed. And so in everyone's eyes, this man is distinctly defined by being the paralyzed guy. That's all most of them might know about him. And when the paralyzed guy comes to Jesus, well, it seems reasonable to expect that he's coming to Jesus because he's paralyzed. And that is obviously a problem that needs fixing. Well, it appears that a man on a mat wasn't the only one who managed to get into the house that day, because a few religious leaders have managed to squeeze in as well. And when they hear what Jesus says to the lame man, they seem to have some thoughts about it. Verse 6. Now, some teachers of the law were sitting there thinking to themselves, why does this man talk like that? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone? Just a little side note here. Notice that the religious leaders are sitting while many people can't even find place to stand to hear Jesus. So they say, why does this man talk like that? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone? Now, the word blaspheme may seem a bit of an archaic word today. So just to make sure we understand its meaning, it generally refers to acting disrespectfully or without reverence towards God or something which is sacred. Why are the religious leaders thinking to themselves that Jesus is blaspheming here? After all, talking about forgiveness and sins seems terribly religious. Well, as Jews, these people believe that no one but God can forgive sins. No one except God can himself declare someone forgiven and pardoned for the wrong they've done. And so when the teachers of the law hear Jesus forgiving this man, they think to themselves, only God has the power to say someone is forgiven for their sins, to say someone is accepted by God. And by saying this, Jesus must be blaspheming in one of two ways. One, he is claiming to be God, or two, he isn't claiming to be God, but he's taking on a role which only belongs to God. Well, the teachers of the law may have been thinking these things in the privacy of their own minds, but they're about to get a real surprise. Verse 8. Immediately Jesus knew in his spirit that this was what they were thinking in their hearts, and he said to them, why are you thinking these things? Which is easier to say to this paralyzed man, your sins are forgiven, or to say, get up, take your mat, and walk? Here Jesus is responding to words the religious leaders never said out loud, but he calls them out and says, why are you thinking this way? Is it easier to say your sins are forgiven or get up and walk? In other words, Jesus is pitching two seemingly impossible things against each other. One is that Jesus indeed has the power and authority to forgive this man for his sins and remove what stands between him and having a relationship with God. And second, saying to a lame man, get up and walk. Well, the leaders don't know how to answer this question. Jesus continues this thought by saying in verse 10, but I want you to know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive his sins. Son of Man is often the term or the title Jesus used to refer to himself. So he says, but I want you to know that the Son of Man I have the authority on earth to forgive sins. And so he says to the man, verse 11, I tell you, get up, take your mat, and go home. He got up, took his mat, and walked out in full view of them all. This amazed everyone, and they praised God, saying, we have never seen anything like this. Jesus said, you don't believe I can rightfully make a person's relationship right with God and forgive and reconcile a person to myself? Well, to prove that I can do that, I will do this other impossible thing. And the paralyzed man gets up, picks up his mat, and walks away. Now, there was a way of viewing illness and specifically disability in Judah in those days. And this view was that all who were ill or were considered disabled in some way, there's a good chance that this is a consequence of either your parents' sins or your own. Being physically disabled, unless it could be traced to a specific event such as a childhood injury or one sustained on the battlefield, tended to mean in the Jewish mindset that someone had sinned, and your outward brokenness reflects your inward brokenness. And so, although the fact that Jesus is talking about this man's sins being forgiven is viewed as blasphemous by the religious leaders, many of the other people standing around would likely see this as a rational progression. Well, of course he needs forgiveness, Jesus. Look at him. It seems logical to them that Jesus should connect this man being paralyzed with him needing forgiveness for his sins. Now, to us reading this may seem like a preposterous connection to make, both misinformed, archaic, and even cruel. Today, we may say, well, we have science. In our time, we understand that disability can come down to an extra chromosome, or to a birth defect, or to DNA. But could it be that even as enlightened readers as we are, that we've filled in some gaps in this story with our own assumptions? First of all, growing up and hearing this story, I've always heard it told as though these four men carrying the paralyzed man are the man's friends. But is that what the text says? Nowhere in the story do we get a description of the relationship. We don't know that they're friends. In fact, we aren't told the intentions of the man at all. For all we know, they could be overzealous neighbors who went and picked up a man they knew to be paralyzed and said, "Right, you clearly have a problem that needs fixing, so we're carrying you to Jesus to be fixed." At no point do we hear from the man. In this story, the man appears to have no voice, or, as is often sadly the case for many disabled people even today, perhaps the man is not given room to have a voice. Could it be that we as readers have done exactly what everyone else did that day? One, identifying the man as being paralyzed and little more. And so his reason for being here must be linked to that. It can't be that he's coming to Jesus for anything else, or even that he's been brought against his will. And secondly, taking one look at the man and concluding, oh, he's here to be healed of paralysis, of course. After all, why would a lame man come to Jesus? Do you remember how we said that in the Jewish mindset, disability tended to mean that someone had sinned? Well, I've heard sermons on this story before, and I've heard precisely this argument being made. Well, Jesus saw a paralyzed man, and he knew that more than needing to be physically healed, he needed forgiveness for his many sins, because Jesus cares more about the spiritual than the physical. The problem with this explanation is that it paints a picture of a man coming to Jesus asking for help, perhaps for healing of his disability. But instead, Jesus turns around and says, well, you need cleansing of your sin more than you need help with this practical matter. But is that truly what the story is saying? Or could it be that Jesus is the only one in that jam-packed room who isn't defining the paralyzed man by his paralysis? Remember, the four men have not explained anything to Jesus. There's no context, no explanation as to why they've brought this man. They don't even say, please heal him. It's very easy for us to say, well, he's paralyzed, so obviously that's why he's been brought. But by saying this, we are simply thinking as the crowd was likely to be thinking that day. Jesus saying, son, your sins are forgiven, isn't, as can easily be assumed, him agreeing with the view that the man's paralysis is his fault or due to his sins. Instead, what Jesus is doing is treating the man like he would treat any other person. Why? Because paralysis was a problem unique to this man, but being a sinner and needing to be accepted is not. Any person who comes to Jesus struggles with sin because all people do. We struggle with the things in our heart which cause us harm and pain, any human being who crosses paths with Jesus by default is in need of acceptance and forgiveness. And so, what Jesus is saying to this man isn't him saying, your paralysis is due to your sin, now let me forgive you for that. It's Jesus not seeing merely a paralyzed man and identifying him solely by his disability. It is Jesus seeing him as a person and greeting that person with the same acceptance which he'd greet anyone else. This is not an act of scrutiny or harsh judgment. It isn't an act of belittling or shaming. It is an act of inclusion and respect. That was our first short story of the day. Our second one is found in the book of Luke, chapter 18, where we continue to follow Jesus on his journey through the country, and we'll be reading from verse 35. As Jesus approached Jericho, a blind man was sitting by the roadside, begging. When he heard the crowd going by, he asked what was happening. They told him, Jesus of Nazareth is passing by. So in our second story, Jesus is on the road again, and he's approaching a town called Jericho. As he's traveling along, he is, as usual, followed by a large crowd. And a blind man who is sitting by the roadside begging hears all this commotion, and he asks, what is going on here? And people tell him Jesus is passing by. At hearing this answer, the blind man calls out in verse 38, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. Those who led the way rebuked him and told him to be quiet, but he shouted all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. In this scene, we find a blind man trying to connect with Jesus, to get his attention. He's asking for help, and he's having to shout it out loud. As a blind man, it would be nearly impossible for him to maneuver his way through all those people in order to find Jesus. He doesn't know what Jesus looks like. He can't single him out in a crowd, and so he's having to raise his voice in order to be heard. But when he does, the people in the crowd reprimand him. They tell him to be quiet. It is clear that in this situation, no one else is going to represent the blind man that day. He knows that if he is to get what he wants, he's going to have to shout. He has to call out for it. And the text says he calls out the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. And if there is one person who never passes by someone who is calling for him, it is Jesus. Verse 40. Jesus stopped and ordered the man to be brought to him. Now, at this point, we may wonder why Jesus doesn't simply go over to the man himself. It seems a bit, bring him hither. But if you've noticed in verse 39, the people who rebuked the blind man were described as leading the way or leading the crowd. In other words, Jesus isn't at the front of the crowd. He is likely in the middle, with people walking and crowding in all around him as he moves. And Jesus is having to actually ask others to go bring the blind man to him, as himself trying to leave behind or disconnect from the crowd without them clinging to him would be nearly impossible. Well, the blind man is brought. When he came near, Jesus asked him, "What do you want me to do for you?" Now, there's something that always used to bother me about the many stories of Jesus healing and helping people. If you read the Gospels, on more than one occasion, Jesus will ask this question before healing a person, a question which may sound something like, "What can I do for you? Do you believe I can heal you?" Examples of these can be found in Matthew 9, Luke 17, Mark 10, and so on. And these used to bother me because I thought it almost feels like a test, an inspection, an exam, like a hoop a person has to jump through to qualify for God's help. Almost like Jesus is saying, let me test the levels of your faith first. Or if you have enough faith and you answer correctly, I will heal you. When a person has a disability, one of the first things that can fly out the window is their autonomy. Due to the way a society treats disabled people, often their sense of freedom, independence, their voice, and their right to choose often gets lost or taken away. And that loss can sometimes be a harder one to deal with than the loss of one's limbs or senses. This loss of autonomy is often reinforced or even caused by the people in the disabled person's life. Now, you'll notice this sometimes if you've been in this situation among medical professionals. When a person is sick or disabled, the medical professional may talk over the person, may talk over the patient. A doctor may talk to the disabled person's relatives instead of the patient himself. And if you have a physical dependence on others, it's easy for them to stop asking you about what you would like or your opinion. Your voice can end up becoming smaller and smaller. One example of this is for those who are wheelchair users. I am a wheelchair user myself, and for some reason, when you're in a wheelchair, often people think they have the right to touch the chair or to move it. It's odd when you think about it. If I was just standing there as another person, a stranger would usually not come over to me, physically pick me up, and move me to somewhere else in the room. So, why is it all right when a person is in a chair? When you're in a wheelchair, sometimes people touch your handlebars or they push your chair around without asking. And there's no asking, may I do this? Or would you like to go there? And this is just a tiny example of the many types of infringements of free will and disrespect which dominates the treatment of many disabled people, even in our society today. Now, with this in mind, we can realize that what Jesus is doing in this story is incredibly powerful. In so many of these stories of healing, you will find Jesus first asking the person before he acts. He is asking, what would you like? Do you want me to do this? And instead of thinking like everybody around, this person is clearly disabled, and of course they want to be so called fixed. Instead, Jesus is handing back something which so many disabled people have taken from them: their choice, their freedom, and their autonomy. Jesus is the one who gave human beings their freedom of choice, and before doing anything else, he restores this gift to them that perhaps so many others have disregarded or taken from them. In the case of the blind man, the man is trying to be heard, and as he tries, people shut him down and tell him to be quiet, as is so often done to those with disabilities. And when the man is brought to Jesus, Jesus gives him a microphone. It's the first thing he does. He doesn't just assume what the man wants. After all, have mercy on me is a pretty broad request and could mean many things. Jesus honors the man's freedom of choice. He makes room for him to speak and says, "What can I do for you?" This is not a test. This is a sign and a show of respect. Can any of us earn God's mercy? Can we ever have enough faith or give the right answer to earn his healing? Surely not. Anything God gives us is a free gift. So Jesus isn't demanding that the blind man jump through hoops to earn healing or to prove something. Instead, he is honoring the man's choice. And the man uses that space and replies, "Lord, I want to see." Jesus said to him, "Receive your sight. Your trust has healed you." Again, not meaning here that the blind man earned sight through his performance, but rather Jesus saying, "You trusted me enough to call out and ask, and here is your free gift. I won't force it on you, but it's available to you if you want it." For the man in question, this isn't just a story about his eyes being restored or fixed. It's a story about him being seen and heard. It's a story about him being respected for his choices and being given a platform. Verse 43, immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus, praising God. When all the people saw it, they also praised God. And it is here we arrive at our third and final short story of the day, found in the book of Mark, chapter 7. Verse 31 says, Then Jesus left the vicinity of Tyre and went through Sidon, down to the Sea of Galilee and into the region of the Decapolis. There some people brought to him a man who was deaf and had a speech impediment, and they asked Jesus to place his hand on him. So we find Jesus on the road again, and in this situation, some people bring to him a man who is deaf and is either unable to speak or has a speech impediment. Now, unlike the story of the blind man, this one more resembles our first story, that of the paralytic. A man is being brought by others to Jesus, and this time they have a specific request. Put your hand on him, meaning presumably heal him. But a man who is deaf and has a speech impediment can walk just fine by himself. He has the use of his legs and his eyes, and yet he is being ushered by others to Jesus, and the people are saying, "Heal him, please." But what does Jesus do? Well, let's have a look. Verse 33. After he took him aside, away from the crowd, Jesus put his fingers into the man's ears. Then he spit and touched the man's tongue. He looked up to heaven and with a deep sigh said to him, Ephphatha, which means be opened. Now, to a modern reader, this seems like a very strange and even deeply uncomfortable scene. Putting your fingers in someone's ears, spitting and touching someone's tongue. What on earth are you doing, Jesus? Have you no regard for personal space or hygiene? But there is something deeply meaningful and impactful which is happening in this scene, and we're going to unpack it. I'd like you to imagine what the deaf man might be experiencing in this story from his perspective. Although he has the use of his own legs, as we said, he is now physically being taken to Jesus. He can't hear what is going on, and he also can't speak up for himself. It may be that he has no idea who Jesus is. Other people are speaking for him, saying to Jesus, do this to him, place your hand on him, heal him. Again, this is a prime example of how a disabled person's voice and freedom can be disregarded or simply not consulted. But we may say, this man can't speak, so how can we consult him? He can't tell us what he wants. How can we respect his choice if he can't express his choice? And therein lies the assumption that just because a person can't communicate the way we're used to or want them to, that their voice can be automatically discounted. But what does Jesus do in response? Well, the first thing he does is take the deaf man away from the crowd. Now, even if this man could read lips or was trying to understand what was going on, being in a crowd of people who are all moving and speaking is hard to keep up with. It can be confusing and even overwhelming for a hearing person. Imagine what it's like for someone who can't hear what's going on and is trying perhaps to read lips and body language and to understand the situation. So instead, Jesus takes the man away from that busy environment, allowing them to be alone in peace, meaning the deaf man can now focus entirely on Jesus and what he's about to do. Now, we face the challenge we mentioned earlier. Jesus, how are you going to ask for this man's consent in a situation where he can't hear your question and he can't verbalize his answer? Keeping in mind this is before a time when sign language as we know it existed. What does Jesus do? First, he puts his fingers in the man's ears. Now we may assume, oh, Well, Jesus is doing this because he's about to heal the man's ears, so he needs to touch the ears in order to heal them. But if you read other stories about Jesus healing, he doesn't need to touch the body part which he's healing. He doesn't even need to be in the same room as the person in question. There are several examples of him healing from afar, simply saying the words, and a person many towns away is healed. Examples like in Mark 7, Matthew 8, Luke 4, and so on. So, why then is Jesus touching the man's ears? Well, Jesus is communicating. He is signaling to the man that whatever is happening concerns his ears. At this point, the deaf man can pull away. He has the freedom to move, to back off. Jesus isn't forcibly invading his personal space without there being freedom for the man to go no by physically backing off. But the man doesn't. And so Jesus moves on. This time he touches the man's tongue. Now, often this text is misread as Jesus spitting on his finger and then placing that spit onto the man's tongue. But the text doesn't say that. It says Jesus spit and then touched the man's tongue. So Jesus spits on the ground for the man to see, and then he touches the man's tongue. But why spit? In Jewish tradition, spit was viewed as having healing power or healing properties. Now, Jesus isn't insinuating that spit has actual healing power. Instead, what we're witnessing is an attempt at sign language. Jesus is using physical signs that would be understood to explain to the man what he'd like to do for him. First sign, he touches his ears. Second sign, he spits, symbolizing healing. And then he touches the man's tongue, signaling speech. So he signs ear, heel, tongue. Jesus is helping the man understand what is going on. He is telling him of his intentions. Jesus is asking the deaf man for permission, for consent. Others may have gone, well, the man can't speak, so there's no point in asking him. But Jesus finds a way, a creative way, of making sure that the man's freedom of choice is respected. And at each step, the man can easily move away, can step back to protect his personal space, or signal, no, I don't want that. And in this case, the man stays, signaling his consent. And we read in verse 34. He, that is Jesus, looked up to heaven and with a deep sigh said to him, Ephphatha, which means be opened. Ephphatha is a word in the language Jesus spoke while on earth, which was Aramaic. Again, Jesus doing this, looking to heaven and sighing, is not a spectacle or a dramatic performance. We may say, why is Jesus being so theatrical in this scene? But he's doing it for the deaf man. So the deaf man can clearly see what is going on and what Jesus is doing. And so as Jesus looks to the sky, he is communicating to the man that his healing is coming from God, from heaven. Verse 35. At this, the man's ears were opened, his tongue was loosened, and he began to speak plainly. In the story of the deaf man, Jesus doesn't use him as a circus animal. His healing him isn't a spectacle or a way to show off his power. Instead, he takes the man away from the crowd. He gives space for the man to understand what's going on and to choose and to give his consent. The man's hearing and speech is restored. And again, the fact that they're in a quiet place shows Jesus' sensitivity and respect for the man. Because imagine hearing, perhaps for the first time in your life. Sounds can be loud, they can be confusing, they may give you sensory overload. And Jesus made sure to protect the deaf man, that the first experience of hearing which the man would have wouldn't be a noise of a bustling crowd or perhaps people cheering that he'd been healed, but the sound of Jesus' voice. Today, we have looked at three stories: the healing of a man who is paralyzed, one who is blind, and one who is deaf. But what ties these stories together is Jesus and the way he treats each of these individuals. There are many people in our society and our communities who live with disabilities and chronic illness. And sometimes when they participate or even just exist around religious people, those people will immediately jump to a place of, I will pray for you. In other words, jumping to, you need to be fixed. Instead of saying, I would like to understand a bit more of how it is to live as you do. Or I'm not going to define you by this thing and include you just as I would anyone else. Or resolving to be a good friend and honor that person's freedom of will, their voice, and their individuality. If you've noticed in each of these three stories, Jesus didn't treat all three of these men the same, lumping them together in a bag and saying, you all need the same thing. Each one he treats differently as an individual. The second thing worth noticing is Jesus prioritized the way he treated them. He didn't just want to hurry forward to the crux of it, right, you need to be fixed. He treated them with kindness and respect on the journey to being healed. Now, it wasn't too long ago that in our society we call disabled people invalids, from the word invalid. And if that isn't indicative of how disabled people are often viewed and treated, then I don't know what is. In contrast to most people, in these stories, Jesus communicates that disabled people are not just broken toys there to be fixed or otherwise ignored. He communicated that whether you choose to live and continue to live with this thing, which diverges from the norm or from the majority, or you wish for him to heal it, he will still welcome you and you will still be treated with respect. Jesus isn't just concerned with restoring the original function of a body part to someone. He makes sure to restore a person's sense of independence and of personhood. He makes sure that the way he goes about it is the right way, treating them with dignity. Jesus leads the way in how we ought to treat people as well. Because to Jesus, these human beings were more than just the lame, the blind, and the deaf. He defined them as more than that. They were persons, his beautiful creations, and he treated them as such. May we learn to do the same.